Man, it's been a while. I haven't done a history type video in a long time, but I recently came across this absolute beast of an iceberg just out in the wild, listing obscure and esoteric Chinese history knowledge, and I immediately thought that it would make an excellent video topic, as well as a great excuse for me to spend all day reading and learning about weird ancient Chinese history. So today, I'll be taking a look at this iceberg and sharing what I learned with all you beautiful and sensual people. But I'll only do the first 2 layers for today, as each entry is pretty thick and will require some extra historical context to fully make sense of. And also, I can use this as a way to gauge interest into a series into this whole deep iceberg. But also, fair warning, as an extremely amateur Western hobbyist historian, I'll definitely be missing some context, butchering names and terms, and I'll probably just get some shit straight up wrong. So please, feel free to scold me for being a damn fool and discuss any of these topics further in the comments. But with all that out of the way, let's not waste any more time and dive right into layer 1. China is a Confucian country. This is the assertion that China is a nation built on the teachings and ideals of Confucianism, which was created by Confucius, a semi-mythological and historical figure and philosopher who is believed to have lived sometime between 550 BC and 480 BC, which is known as the Spring and Autumn period in Chinese history, a semi-legendary period between the Zhou Dynasty and the Warring States period. And Confucianism isn't exactly a typical religion as we understand it here in the West, where Big C here is worshipped as a god with divinely blessed knowledge, whose worshippers patronize and glaze him at a temple or shrine. But rather, it's more of a collection of rules, ideals, and rituals for a virtuous life and society in China, as told through dialogues with Confucius and stories of his life written by Confucius's disciples, as seen in his 4 books and 5 classics, and the 5 fundamental bonds, which are between master and servant, which symbolizes loyalty, father and son, which symbolizes filial piety, husband and wife, which symbolizes love and obedience, big brother and little brother, which symbolizes brotherliness, naturally, and friend, which represents faithfulness, and the 5 virtues for life, which are benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and trustworthiness, all of which are steeped in the idealized traditions and philosophies of ancient to them at the time, China, which is understood to be the Zhou Dynasty and the other dynasties that came before that. Confucius believing that these ancient dynasties had an idealized society that we must return to through his practices. Confucianism highlights the need for men to be virtuous and honorable in their dealings and their professional lives, and the importance of filial piety and respect for hierarchy in the government and the family unit, which Confucius saw as a microcosm of government itself. And Confucianism as a philosophical and political system has existed in China for over 2,500 years, and over that long-ass time, it has occasionally been repressed, most notably by the legalist Qin dynasty. But luckily for Big C here, the Qin dynasty lasted only a meager 14 years, and crumbled shortly after its emperor Qin Shi Huang died, the Han dynasty taking its place, which made Confucianism the state ideology. However, by the 1900s, Confucianism had declined severely as a rigid societal doctrine, and most practitioners of Confucianism were Confucian because they were government officials, as entry into the government was based on Confucian civil service exams, where you'd spent 3 days locked in a testing cell, perfectly citing and quoting Confucian literature in a hard-as-shit test that had a failure rate of 99%. But the decline started in earnest with the abolishment of Confucian imperial service exams in 1905, and was further rejected under Mao's Cultural Revolution, who saw Confucianism as antiquated dogma, holding China back from communist utopia. The CCP heavily persecuting its adherents and destroying temples and statues dedicated to old Big C. However, despite Confucianism no longer being the political force that it once was, Confucian teachings and philosophy still heavily influenced Chinese society. Filial piety and reverence for hierarchy are still very deeply ingrained in Chinese culture, and many Chinese still revere old Big C and his teachings, as many statues and temples to Big C were restored under Deng Xiaoping. And making the claim that China is a Confucian country would still be a relatively accurate statement to make. Laozi taught Confucius. Laozi, which literally translates to old master or old philosopher, is one of the mythical creators of Taoism, who may have lived sometime between the 6th and 4th century BCE, who is traditionally credited with writing the Tao Te Ching, one of the foundational Taoist texts. The other foundational Taoist text is the Zhuangzi, whose authorship is attributed to philosopher Zhuangzhou, and it's pretty great stuff. He had a dream where he was a butterfly and everything. It's real cute, but this entry doesn't concern him. Taoism is a very spiritual, abstract, and naturalistic belief system that emphasizes the necessity for people to live in harmony with the Tao, aka the way. A definitionally indescribable energy force that flows through all things and dictates the rules of the universe. And Taoism is all about going with the flow of life and obtaining a spiritual harmony between oneself and the natural world, and taking the path of least resistance and not struggling against the natural order of all things. You know, the yin and the yang, all that good stuff, which sort of conflicts with the more rigidly defined and hierarchical nature of Confucianism. However, stories from Chinese mythology have claimed that Confucius sought out and learned from the wise old master himself while he was in the eastern Zhou capital of Luoyang, who then dropped some sage wisdom on old Big C, who asked him how to obtain the Tao, to which he responded, not through rules and regulations and rigorous study and pretty much everything you stand for, that's for sure. And after pondering this response for a time, Confucius then asked him how does he know the virtues of righteousness, and Laozi schooled him again, saying that only immoral people spend their time ruminating on morality, and to just be natural and authentic in your dealings. And this response completely humbled Big C, who was trembling from the fallout of the truth nuke that was just dropped on him, and he immediately left afterwards. And when later asked about their meeting, Confucius allegedly said, "I know how a bird can fly. I know how a fish can swim, but I do not know how Laozi could rise and fly like a sublime dragon on the clouds in the sky." However, this is just a mythological story, and it's highly unlikely the two ever met, as outside the Tao Te Ching, a foundational Taoist text that traditionally credits him as the sole author, Laozi is a historical ghost, and no other contemporary records or solid archaeological proof of him exist, only stories written long after he would have lived, like this one. And some stories claim that Laozi's real name might have been Lai Ar or Lai Dan. Makes sense. I don't think ancient Chinese families were naming their kids Old Master, and he was the head archivist, or a historian of some kind, of Luoyang, and he met Confucius, and then, fed up with the corruption and unnatural state of society that was completely out of whack with the Tao, he hopped on the back of a water buffalo and rode out into the wilderness to live a simple, natural life in harmony with the Tao, writing the Tao Te Ching in a single sitting when a border guard stopped him from going out into the mountains and made him justify his new sage hermit lifestyle. However, these are all just old legends that are very lean in actual details, and many historians now believe that the Tao Te Ching had several authors and was slowly edited and modified over several centuries. So this story of Laozi and Big C linking up is just that, a story, and likely exists to synergize the more rigid and traditional hierarchical order of Confucianism with the more naturalistic, simple, personal, and freeform life teachings of Taoism, as many Chinese follow both Taoist and Confucian practices simultaneously, usually following Confucianist practices and traditions in their professional and social lives, while following Taoist teachings for their personal and spiritual lives. Great Wall Imperialism. We all know the Great Wall of China, one of the man-made wonders of the world, an iconic piece of human architecture, and a physical testament to China's longevity and ingenuity. However, as you likely know, the Great Wall isn't just a single continuous country-sized wall, and is rather an amalgamation of many different walls, built over thousands of years by many different imperial dynasties for different purposes, ranging in construction methods from massive brick towers and walls to simple compacted dirt walls. And I believe this entry is referring to the Great Wall being a reflection of the imperialist mindsets and capabilities of the dynasties who built them. The walls weren't just defensive, and they played a big role in projecting and maintaining imperial power along its border regions. The most famous parts of the Great Wall, the Ming Dynasty walls, not only served as a buffer against northern Mongolian raiders and invaders, but it also allowed the Ming to project power and keep a permanent military presence in the northern territories of their empire, which were full of nomadic and Mongolian peoples that the Ming weren't exactly big fans of. And the Han Dynasty built long walls that stretched far to the west, so they could better patrol and administrate the lucrative Silk Road, while at the same time expanding their own borders. And basically, a wall equals, this is Han territory, bitch. And even the very first Chinese emperor, Huang, built walls all across his kingdom as a way to not only establish his military prowess and borders, but to also flex his power to mobilize and control large populations for his imperial projects, as many peasants and convicts were pressed into forced labor to build the walls, with many perishing under the brutal physical conditions. And a wall by itself may seem purely defensive, but across Chinese history, building a wall was oftentimes a purely aggressive and expansionist move. Wang Mang did nothing wrong. Wang Mang was the one and only emperor of the short-lived Qin dynasty, after he had seized the imperial throne of the Han Dynasty in 9 CE. Born a relative to the ruling family of the current Han Dynasty, his aunt was married to the Yuan Emperor of Han, you see. Mang had slowly built up his influence in the imperial court by presenting himself as a humble and honest Confucian man, taking no concubines and not hoarding his wealth, instead spending his time studying and caring for his large and influential family, which gained him lots of respect and aura amongst the elites of the imperial court. And eventually, the current emperor of Han, died suddenly. And without an heir. Oh shit. And Wang Mang, who was living a humble life in his fief at the time, was then recalled and appointed head of the armed forces and government by his royal aunt, Grand Empress Dowager Wang. The two of them choosing an 8-year-old boy with a heart condition that made his lips turn blue, who was a male descendant of the Empress Dowager's husband's line, as the new Emperor Ping of Han, with Wang Mang acting as his regent until he came of age, making Wang Mang the ruler of China in all but name. And during that time, Wang Mang began building up a cult of personality around himself, encouraging his family and supporters to find and submit quote-unquote evidence of divine signs or apocryphal Confucian prophecies that claim that he was destined to rule over an ideal Confucian society, steeped in the ancient traditions of the Zhou dynasty from 500 to up to 1,000 years ago. And as you'll see later, discovering or publishing apocryphal Confucian texts and prophecies that predict you as a future emperor was a very legitimate political tactic for the time. Inconveniently, little Emperor Ping died in 6 CE at age 14, less than 5 years after ascending to the throne, many believing that Mang had poisoned Ping himself. And even more conveniently, shortly after Ping's untimely passing, the mayor of South Chang'an City claimed to have found a mysterious rock that had red text written on it that claimed to have said something along the lines of, Wang Mang, Duke of Anhan, should be emperor. Well, if a mysterious rock says so, and then add in a fabricated lineage that suddenly reveals Wang Mang to be a descendant of the legendary Yellow Emperor, and Mang used his massive influence and this supposed divine evidence to seize the throne and proclaim that the mandate of heaven had officially passed to him, declaring the start of a new Shin dynasty in 9 CE, and he began implementing sweeping reforms to be more in line with his ideal Confucian society. His biggest change coming in the form of radical land redistribution, as Wang dabbled in a little bit of first century communism, declaring that all land belongs to the empire, and private property was seized from wealthy landowners and was redistributed evenly to local farming families to be worked on behalf of the empire. But subjects would be charged a quote-unquote sloth tax for leaving their land uncultivated or for refusing to work. He created 28 new types of coins and currency to be used. He abolished slavery and made being a slave owner punishable by slavery, ironically. Well, fair is fair, I guess. And he introduced state-owned monopolies on vital resources and industries, like on liquor, salt, iron, coinage, forestry, and fishing, to try and centralize and restore imperial economic power. And these were some truly ambitious and progressive reforms. However, they backfired horribly for Mang in practice, as his land reforms pissed off landowners, as they obviously weren't pleased with their lands and slaves being forcibly taken from them. The 28 types of currency plan turned out to be insanely idiotic, as the large amount of different types of coins made out of all different materials, like gold, silver, copper, and even tortoise and cowrie shells, made it borderline impossible to determine what kinds of coins were valid, what their exchange values were, and it made checking for counterfeits an absolute nightmare, effectively grinding the money system in China to a halt, eventually forcing Mang to return to a more traditional two-coin system. However, the death knell for Wang Mang came when he lost the support of the peasants, as his reforms failed to actually improve their lives and material conditions, and oftentimes made things much worse for them, like crashing the economy of 28 different types of weird coins. The sloth tax forced peasants who lived in mountainous or arid regions, or who had retired to live quiet lives, to return to work and move back in with their children to avoid being taxed into poverty. And the Shin dynasty became very ineffective and corrupt, as imperial magistrates failed to properly supervise, or sometimes even bother to visit their provinces and pay out proper salaries, which created the ideal conditions for corruption and bribery to run rampant amongst local officials. And to make a shitty situation even worse, the Yellow River does what it always does. It flooded during his reign, resulting in massive famines. These disasters leading the agrarian masses to believe that Mang had lost the mandate of heaven, and they began calling for the restoration of the Han dynasty. This eventually led to several large peasant uprisings, and eventually, the fragmented rebel groups banded together, and under the leadership of Liu Shu, the later emperor of the restored Han dynasty, they eventually attacked Mang at his capital of Chang'an, the rebels quickly overpowering the demoralized and corrupt Shin military. And seeing the Jin dynasty was officially a cooked product, the men inside Chang'an rose up against Mang as well, and attacked him at his royal palace, where he made one last final stand before getting ganked by the mob, where his body was then reportedly viciously fought over by the attackers, 10 people dying in the struggle to claim his body so they could claim all the glory for the kill, which was then chopped to pieces, the head being delivered to the current Han capital to be hung on its walls as a trophy, only for an angry mob to allegedly later take it down and kick it around like a soccer ball. And apparently, one person even cut Mang's tongue out and ate it. Damn, wonder how it tasted. And Mang's death and Liu Shu's ascension as the Guangyu Emperor marked the end of the Shin dynasty and the restoration of the Han, now known as the Eastern Han or the post-Shin dynasty. And now, This entry claims that Wang Mang actually did nothing wrong, and he was wholly justified in deposing the Han in order to bring about his glorious proto-communist Confucian dynasty. And although he had some insanely progressive policies for the time, like radical land redistribution, the abolishment of slavery, and centralized government control over industry, Wang Mang definitely did more than a few things wrong, as he relied far too heavily on Confucian virtue and magical thinking to make everything work when planning out his new dynasty. Mang seemed convinced that the government would be benevolent and highly efficient once the ancient practices of the Zhou were restored. But he spent more time trying to rediscover how ancient Zhou imperial bureaucracy actually worked, rather than, governing his current empire, because the Zhou dynasty was already well over 500 years old by the time he was alive. And the actual fine details on how they administrated their government were mythological at best, which led to more theorizing and debate rather than actual governing. But the true end was when his inefficient and corrupt as shit government eventually made the peasantry believe that he was no longer worthy of the mandate of heaven by creating horrific economic conditions and failing to properly respond to natural disasters, leading to the mass revolts that eventually claimed his life on the steps of his palace. The Viscount of Ji founded Korea. The exact origins of Korea are not fully known, as the existence of modern-day Korea starts with the founding of the Kingdom of Go-Joseon, which translates to Ancient Joseon, which according to most Korean mythology, was created in the year 2333 BCE by its legendary founder, a man named Dangun, who was said to be the grandson of the, quote, Lord of Heaven himself. The Lord of Heaven had a son, who then descended to earth from the heavens to live amongst his people, until he was approached by a bear and a tiger, who could somehow communicate with him, and they asked him to make them human, which Dangun's father agreed to, as long as they passed a special test for him. He told the beasts that if they could survive in a cave for 100 days while eating only mugwort and garlic as food, he'd reward them and turn them into humans like it's some kind of ancient heavenly Mr. Beast challenge. The tiger failed the test, but the bear stayed for the full 100 days, and as a reward, she was then turned into a beautiful woman by Dangun's father, who were then married. However, this is just one founding myth, and there's another more, let's say, grounded myth of Korea's founding. In this other myth, which comes from mythological historical chronicles like the Samguk Yusa, purports that a man named Gija, or Jiji, or Kiji, depending on who you ask, was a nobleman and sage from the ancient Shang Dynasty, which is reported to have existed from 1600 to 1000 BC, and he had fled to the northern Korean peninsula around 1122 BC, during the fall of the Shang dynasty, as it transitioned to the succeeding Zhou dynasty, and he had founded the Gija Joseon dynasty there with his followers. However, this is just a myth, and it's very unlikely to be true, and it's likely to be a later myth created when Korea was under heavier Chinese and Confucian influence, as there's no archaeological or contemporary evidence to support the claim that Gija settled in Korea, and chronicles that describe his founding of the Gija Joseon, like the aforementioned Samguk Yusa, weren't written until in or around 1280 AD, 2 whole millennia later from the time the alleged founding of Gija Joseon took place. And that's a lot of time for a story to fall into speculation and legend. However, around that time, the ruling state of Korea, the Goryeo, were heavily influenced by, and were even temporary vassals of Yuan dynasty China, although they were far from a puppet state, as Korean culture and identity remained strong despite strong influence from their Yuan neighbors. Therefore, it's likely that the story of a mythical ancient Chinese nobleman founding Korea was created in order to tie Korean and Chinese cultures closer together through a shared mythological heritage, and to justify the current nobility's rule by claiming deep ties to ancient and revered civilizations and Confucian tradition, which was quite influential in the Goryeo era. So did Jiji from Shang create Korea? Probably not. Sun Tzu was a pacifist. This theory claims that Sun Tzu, the legendary author of The Art of War, one of the most historically important and famous treatises on how to wage and win wars, was actually a war-hating pacifist? Well, it may not sound too crazy after we take a closer look. After all, in The Art of War, Sun Tzu stresses the importance of, quote, winning without fighting, and even says, quote, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Master Sun here spends a lot of time stressing the importance of using deception, subterfuge, espionage, careful planning, immense preparation, and intelligent maneuvering to defeat your enemy, instead of just smashing 2 armies together to see which group of dudes can kill the other first. And he also calls war itself an unpreferred response, and should only be engaged in it begrudgingly, if no other responses are possible to avoid conflict. However, despite Sun Tzu's reluctance to gleefully throw his armies into massive battles and slaughter sessions to obliterate his foes and plunder their lands, Sun Tzu is far from a pacifist. As a pacifist, by definition, does not believe that warfare is ever justifiable or necessary, but Sun Tzu clearly acknowledges the necessity and inevitability of war as a tool of statecraft, and as a mode of conflict resolution between populations and factions. And if he was a pacifist, he wouldn't have written a masterclass on how to expertly and efficiently engage in and actually win wars. The three teachings are one. This refers to the big three of Chinese philosophy and religion: Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, known as the three teachings, or Sanjiao. Despite all three of these teachings being their own distinct belief and philosophical systems that can be followed in isolation, and oftentimes the three may conflict with each other in terms of their teachings and ideals. With Confucianism focused on reverence for hierarchy and social virtue in relationships, Taoism focusing on connecting to the natural way of the universe by leading a simple, spiritual life in harmony with nature, and Buddhism is focused on separating oneself from suffering and worldly desire by obtaining spiritual enlightenment. And this theory claims that despite all their differences, due to how influential to Chinese society and just how old these religions and schools of thought are, the average Chinese person will be influenced by all three of these teachings simultaneously, and even harmoniously, and would practice rituals and beliefs from all three over the course of their lives, essentially combining the three teachings into one syncretic belief system that still deeply influences Chinese culture to this day. A person could be doing a Taoist meditation or breathing technique in their living room, while a Buddha statue watches them from a shelf, while their live-in grandparents are watching TV in a different room. Niels Bohr was a Taoist. Niels Bohr was a Danish physicist who was best known for developing the Bohr model of the atom, which was the first atomic model to introduce the idea that electrons orbit the nucleus, but can jump to different orbit levels, and in turn, energy levels. And he also even worked alongside Bob Oppenheimer on the Manhattan Project, as he had fled Nazi-occupied Denmark in 1943, before joining on with the British mission to help develop the Big Bomb. However, it's theorized that Bohr may have actually been a secret Taoist, due to a few factors. One is his introduction of, and fascination with the concept of complementarity, where he postulates that objects like electrons can act as both particles and waves, but never both at once, based on how you measure and observe each behavior. And this very closely mirrors Taoist teachings of the yin and yang, that seemingly opposing forces are actually complementary, in a way that can never be truly empirically measured, as well as the contradictory nature of the Tao itself, which is understood to be paradoxical and indescribable in nature by Taoists, much like how it's paradoxical that an electron can be both a wave and a particle in different contexts, this paradoxical nature being the very foundation of quantum physics and theory. The second factor is a bit more obvious though, as following the end of World War II, in 1947, Bohr was awarded the Danish Order of the Elephant, a highly prestigious distinction usually only reserved for Danish royalty and generals, and as a perk of being in the Elephant Club, you get your coat of arms put on a Wall of Fame display in Frederiksberg Castle. And not having a coat of arms already, Niels designed one for himself, and right smack dab in the middle of it is a large black and red yin and yang, or otherwise known as a Tai Chi, symbol, along with the Latin phrase contraria sunt complementa, which means opposites are complementary. Now this may seem like a smoking gun that old Niels Bohr was flowing with the Tao and praising Lao Tzu on the daily, but it's pretty unlikely that Niels was a true believer in Taoism and practiced it in any spiritual context, as Bohr was known to be a non-religious man. But it's pretty clear that he was philosophically and even scientifically influenced by Taoist teachings of paradoxes in the natural world and the complementary existence of seemingly opposing forces when he was developing his theory of complementarity and quantum mechanics. And Niels was also a member of Aranos, an intellectual discussion group founded in 1933 that held lectures and debate on synergizing religious belief with natural sciences, and he may have learned much about Taoism and its teachings of paradoxical phenomena in nature from his time there. And that's it for layer 1, so let's head to the surface with layer number 2. Mercury levels in Qin Shi Huang's tomb. You probably all know about the Terracotta Army, right? Over 8,000 unique and finely detailed terracotta statues of ancient Chinese soldiers and chariots that were originally discovered by farmers digging in the ground in 1974, while they were digging for water sources on the outskirts of the modern-day city of Xi'an. The Terracotta Army is an archaeological marvel in its own right, but they're just the muscle, as they were created to silently guard the massive tomb of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, the founder of the Qin Dynasty, who by conquest ended the Warring States period and declared himself emperor of a newly unified China in 221 BC. His mausoleum reportedly took 38 years to build, and construction started pretty much right away when Qin Shi Huang took the throne of Qin at age 13, back when he was known as Ying Zheng, and it was built all throughout his life, conquests and reunification and all, up until his death in 210 BC. And ancient descriptions of the actual main complex of his tomb makes those massive terracotta army pits look like shitty holes in the ground in comparison. His tomb is a massive underground city complex modeled after the Qin capital of Xinyang, complete with inner and outer walls, and a foliage-covered pyramid that sits above the central mausoleum. However, this central mausoleum still remains an archaeological mystery, as the main tomb is still yet to be fully excavated by Chinese authorities, which is really frustrating for a history geeker like myself, as according to Sima Qian, an ancient Han Dynasty-era Chinese historian, in his historical chronicle, the Shiji, Qian paints a spectacular picture of the place. He claims it's full of wondrous treasures, deadly arrow booby traps, a ceiling dome decorated with beautiful artistic recreations of the sun, moon, and constellations, and most interestingly, he claims that rivers of mercury flow through the tomb, powered by some unknown mechanism, with the floor of the tomb built to resemble the rivers and seas of China. In a recreation of the geography of Qin China, with strikingly silver rivers that actually flow, sounds like quite the sight to behold. Sounds like a place Indiana Jones or Nathan Drake would find themselves in, and then promptly destroy somehow by flipping a switch or grabbing a treasure off a table. Now these reports may seem a bit fanciful, but Sima Qian seems to be correct about the large amount of mercury in the tomb, as modern geochemical and soil surveys of the tomb complex as recently as 2016 have confirmed abnormally high levels of mercury and mercury vapor in the surrounding soil. Also, according to Qian, Qin Shi Huang was obsessed with immortality and finding or creating a life-extending elixir, and it was believed that mercury, or more accurately, mercury sulfite, or cinnabar, was a key ingredient in any immortality potion, which would be mixed into a potion in a red powdered form. Qin Shi Huang wasn't just taking swigs of straight quicksilver to try and extend his life like I originally pictured in my head. But, unfortunately for those early Chinese apothecaries, mercury kinda does the opposite of extending life, and it actually rots your cerebral cortex and internal organs and immune system from the inside out. Whoops. And Qin Shi Huang's fascination with drinking quicksilver old fashions probably, and ironically, accelerated his demise, as he may have suffered from mercury poisoning in his later years, before dying at the age of 49, as he became more erratic, paranoid, and his physical condition rapidly deteriorated, which could have been due to mercury-fueled internal organ rot. Now, until China decides to fully excavate the central tomb to see what's going on down there, we will never know the full scope of what it looks like and how much mercury is actually present in the tomb, and if it can even flow as claimed, because who knows if the mercury flow mechanism was just a myth, and maybe all the mercury had sunk into the ground ages ago. And unfortunately, China is in no rush whatsoever to excavate the tomb, as officials say it would take millions and millions of dollars, could result in irreversible damage to the actual tomb, workers could be exposed to dangerously high levels of mercury vapor, and many Chinese are of the opinion that the tomb should never be opened at all, out of respect and reverence for their dead ancestors. And many Chinese find ancestral kinship in the first official emperor of China, so we may never truly know the full scope of how much mercury is being held down there, and how exactly it's being used. Well, at least until old Xi decides to get up off his buns and pick up a shovel, I guess. Yunnan mushroom fatality stats. This refers to Yunnan sudden/unexpected death syndrome, in which residents of Yunnan province in south-central China, who seemed perfectly healthy, would suddenly go into cardiac arrest and expire shortly after. And these deaths were quite odd, as they'd only occur between June and August and at an altitude of 1,800 to 2,400 meters, and an estimated 400 people may have died from these sudden death cases over the span of 3 decades. So after a years-long investigation into the deaths by the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention, they eventually pinned down our killer in question. Turns out, local foragers were unknowingly harvesting and eating a toxic mushroom native to the Yunnan province, the Trogia venenata, or the little white mushroom, which contains 3 amino acids toxic to humans, and foragers would often eat them, as they were cheap, rarely sold, and spoiled quickly after being picked, making them an ideal quick and cheap snack for these humble foragers. However, this doesn't explain everything. A scientific examination of the mushroom has led scientists to conclude that there aren't enough toxins in the mushroom to kill a human outright, and they believe that the deaths may have been from a combination of eating the shrooms, along with consuming a large amount of barium, which the local water supply was reportedly full of. Or maybe it's just from eating lots of semi-toxic fungus. But once the link was made between deaths and mushroom consumption, along with the government telling locals not to eat the little white shroom anymore, it seems the sudden death cases in Yunnan province dropped dramatically, and all the articles I found about the mushroom poisoning seemed to be only from 2010 to 2012, with no other reports or articles from after 2012, so it seems like YSDS isn't much of a problem anymore. But still, 400 deaths is still a huge kill count for some little white shrooms. Strongman Confucius. Now when you learn about Confucius, you may picture him as a soft, wizened, and hunched over philosopher, but according to our old pal Sima Qian, in his historical chronicle the Shiji, Confucius was actually an absolute unit of a man, and had physical measurements and feats that made him seem more like Thor Bjornsson than any old wise Chinese sage. And according to the Shiji, Confucius, whose real name was Kongshu, and Confucius is actually just the Latinized version of his official title, Confucia, Confucius. Get it? See? It's kind of there, but not really. Well, Master Kong here reportedly rose up to a gargantuan 9'6" tall. But this is actually a common mistake with the conversion of Han Chinese measurement units. And based on the numbers recorded in the Shiji and converted to modern feet and inches, Confucius would have reportedly stood at either 6'5" up to a massive 7'2", making him a beast among men for ancient China, where 5'4" was considered an average height. This is like Victor Wembanyama height, and the people were amazed by his size, apparently even calling him just tall guy. And Qian even goes on to claim that Confucius could, quote, hold up the bolt of a city gate. And this isn't just some large metal nail either. The bolt in this context is a massive reinforced log that was placed on city gates to protect them from siege engines. And here's a picture of 4 lowly non-Confucian mortals holding one for reference. So imagine a Chinese version of Shaq that's also twice as muscular. And you got how Qian pictured Confucius in his writings, as not only could he lift hundreds of pounds by himself, he also encouraged his disciples to practice the 6 arts, which included riding chariots and archery, 2 pretty physically demanding activities, as you have to control several charging horses at once, and ancient longbows often took an immense amount of strength to draw and fire properly, as they were designed to pierce armor. Now, as much as I want to believe that Confucius, the wise sage and master of dialogues, was a yoked as fuck lifter ogre man, his anomalous height and powerful feats of strength were very likely embellished by later historians and chroniclers like Qian to make Confucius seem even more godlike and virtuous in the eyes of the people of China, making him a larger-than-life historical figure, literally. Hopping zombie vampires. This refers to the Zhongshe, which literally translates to stiff corpse, an undead zombie vampire-like creature that moves around exclusively by hopping. They have rigor mortis, you see. They can't walk due to their stiff bones. It can only hop. Yeah, don't think about it too hard. They look like your typical decayed dead bodies and zombies, but with sharp vampiric teeth for sucking out life force, or chi, out of living people to kill them. They're spiritual vampires, not literal bloodsuckers. Although some depictions still have them suck blood out of a human's neck like a classic Western vampire, and they hold their arms straight out like any good zombie cliche. And also, in most movies and image depictions of Zhongshe, they're almost always wearing Qing Dynasty robes and hats, as most Zhongshe stories solidified their lore during the Qing Dynasty, and because these robes are just overall pretty cool looking in my opinion. But the most interesting thing about these hopping corpses is their connection to Taoist magic and taboos. Unlike your normal Western zombies who are animated by some barely understood sci-fi zombie virus, Zhongshe can rise from the grave for a number of magical and spiritual reasons, all of which are steeped in traditional Chinese funeral rites and taboos about the dead, as looking at a corpse has been considered bad luck in Chinese culture for millennia. And making sure corpses are buried with all the proper rites and rituals in their ancestral tombs has always been an extremely high priority for familial clans. And when a family member died far away from home, their bodies were usually transported back home over long distances by hired porters who would only travel at night. So, a corpse can rise as a Zhongshe if a person dies far from home and is not properly buried, if they die in an unnatural way, such as through suicide or murder, and the body is untended to, if their unburied corpse is struck by lightning, or if a pregnant cat leaps over their coffin, if their soul fails to fully leave their body for whatever reason, if the corpse absorbs enough chi to be reanimated, if someone is wounded by a Zhongshe and is taken over by their, quote, Zhongshe poison, or if an evil sorcerer raises them from the dead. And you may notice that many depictions of the Zhongshe have these paper tag looking things stuck to their heads, and these are actually Taoist talismans, and they're used to control the Zhongshe through dark Taoist magic, and the spells in them usually are written in chicken blood. And these Zhongshe aren't just mindless shamblers, and they usually have super strength and some formidable combat prowess. They have sharp claw-like nails that they can use like knives, they can tilt and lean their bodies at extreme angles, and in some cases, they can even fly, if they absorb enough chi. And I'm rage quitting a zombie apocalypse if I see some fucking flying zombies. To defeat a Zhongshe, we have several options. You can use martial arts to destroy its body, although this is pretty difficult. You can stick a talisman of your own onto its head to pacify it until it can be reburied and fully put to rest. You can throw chicken or black dog blood on it to incapacitate it, throw sticky rice at the corpse to draw out the evil within it, use a mirror on the Zhongshe to scare it off. A rooster's call can scare them off too, as it signals the coming sunrise. And as vampires, they don't do well in the sun. And weapons made from the wood of peach trees are super effective against Zhongshe, as peaches and peach trees have special spiritual powers of longevity and immortality in Taoist belief. And there's several other ways to pacify or destroy them, all of which are steeped in Chinese superstition and folklore. And nowadays, the Zhongshe mostly exist as iconic, powered-up zombies for magical martial artists to fight against them in movies like the Mr. Zombie series, or as fodder for gooners. Tang Zoroastrianism. This refers to the presence and practice of the religion known as Zoroastrianism in China during the Tang Dynasty of 618 to 907 CE. Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, was created in ancient Persia, modern-day Iran, by a mythical sage named Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, whose birthday is unknown, and he could have been born anywhere in the range between 1500 BCE and 600 BCE at the latest. And Zoroastrians believe in Ahura Mazda, a supreme god of light and goodness, and the creator of the universe. Ahura Mazda is locked into an eternal conflict with a destructive spirit, and the embodiment of all evil, darkness, and lies, Angra Mainyu, with Zoroastrians believing that Ahura Mazda will eventually triumph over the dark forces of Angra Mainyu, and shall one day purify the earth with his holy light. Zoroastrianism reached China via the Silk Road, as Persian, Sogdian, and other Zoroastrian merchants and traders who traveled it would carry their religion with them. And the Tang Dynasty ruled while the Silk Road was at its peak, expanding their territory deep into the west to maintain and protect the Silk Road. This bountiful trade turning the capital city of Chang'an and other cities like Luoyang into very cosmopolitan and diverse cities, full of different religions and people, which was helped greatly by the Tang Dynasty's tolerance for foreign religions, although they heavily discouraged locals from converting to or even engaging with these monotheistic foreigners. And soon, Zoroastrian fire temples began being built for the worshippers who lived in these diverse cities, as Zoroastrians believe in praying towards a fire or a source of light, as it embodies the goodness of Ahura Mazda. However, tolerance for Zoroastrianism in Tang China began to fall off a cliff after the An Lushan rebellion, when a Tang general of Sogdian Gokturk descent, who was named, can you guess? That's right, An Lushan, rebelled against the Tang Dynasty and attempted to establish his new Yan Dynasty, and he may have ended up killing damn near half the population of Tang China in the process. This rebellion featuring horrifically brutal sieges, where up to 20,000 civilians may have been eaten, and I've got a whole video about it from a while back if you want to learn more. It's a bit raw, and it's a bit old, but it's not shit. I promise. I pinky promise. And since An Lushan and his succeeding kin were all seen as foreigners, naturally, foreigners were then blamed for the mass death and chaos of the rebellion, and massacres and discrimination of their populations, including Zoroastrians, were rampant. And things got even worse in 1840, when the new Emperor Wuzhong began cracking down hard on Buddhism. This persecution soon extending to all non-Chinese foreign religions, which were all denounced as perversions of nasty-ass Buddhism, with Zoroastrianism again included. So, more massacres and persecution, yay, with Zoroastrianism eventually completely fading away from Chinese society and records by around 1200 CE. And since preaching to and converting the Han Chinese people to Zoroastrianism was heavily discouraged and oftentimes legally banned, the religion never really took root outside of Sogdian and Persian communities within large Chinese cities. But it's still an interesting footnote in history, and it goes to show how worldly and at times diverse this era of the Tang Dynasty was. Chenwei Apocrypha. This refers to the Chenwei texts, which is sort of a blanket term to describe a collection of prophetic and mystical writings that emerged and were widely circulated during the Han Dynasty. They were commentaries/expansions on classic Confucian canon texts, and are considered Apocrypha, which isn't that slimy tentacle library dimension from Skyrim. Apocrypha essentially means that the religious text in question is considered unreliable or hidden knowledge, and is not a part of the religion's official canon. If you recall our old friend Wang Mang, you'll remember that he was a staunch Confucian, and in order to build his case for emperor and justify his upcoming usurpation, he asked his supporters to identify and present divine signs and prophecy of his rule, like that mysterious rock that they found that said that he should be emperor written on it. But another aspect of this divine justification scheme is that Mang likely commissioned or forged Chenwei texts of his own that expand on the Confucian classics and now conveniently predict Wang Mang's coming as a future emperor of China. And when Mang eventually fell and had his head used as a soccer ball, the man who eventually restored the Han Dynasty, Emperor Guangyu, disseminated apocryphal charts of his own to predict and justify his coming ascension to emperor, along with publishing additional apocryphal material that deified Confucius, turning him from a legendary sage philosopher to a divine, messianic figure that could descend to earth from heaven itself. But it's hard to tell how many Chenwei texts were made and what their contents actually were, as many of them have been lost, destroyed, fragmented, forged, and intentionally suppressed for political reasons, and many texts, now lost, are only referenced in passing by other texts that managed to survive, and their actual contents are steeped in ancient esoteric Han Dynasty Chinese mythology from 2,000 years ago that blended Confucian, Taoist, and legalist beliefs in a way that a modern person would struggle mightily to try and make sense of. I mean, some famous apocryphal texts like the Hetu and Loshu were said to have first been seen imprinted on the back of a, quote, dragon turtle who emerged out of the Yellow River, and inscribed on the side of a qilin, or a dragon horse, which is like a dragon, deer, horse, unicorn, chimera creature. whose presence is often seen as an omen of the arrival of a sage or a great ruler in Chinese mythology that also emerged out of the Yellow River somehow. And these texts contain charts of interconnected circles and squares. My Westoid brain is breaking just trying to make sense of these things. But anyway, historians believe anywhere from 30 to even over 100 apocryphal texts may have been crafted and circulated, and as we understand them today, they are mostly used as a justification for new dynasties, like we see with Wang Mang, and also to help explain shifts in power in Han-era China, the time when these texts were most revered and used, through esoteric writings and charts that built off the pre-existing Confucian lore, which sort of became a tradition in the centuries to come, for any new, upstart Chinese rulers to justify their suddenly divinely mandated status. And sometimes, you can't just wait around for heaven to give you the mandate, and you gotta speed up the process a little bit. Although, by the Tang and Song eras, these apocryphal texts are mostly dismissed as superstition and forgery, as they begun to truly understand the political power that Chenwei texts can wield in the right hands. And nobody wants to deal with rebels and usurpers who think their cause is divinely predicted in some newly uncovered lore. And as Confucian orthodoxy solidified around the core classic texts, rulers suddenly had little tolerance for new revelations and convenient hidden meanings. Shang human sacrifice. The Shang dynasty, which is believed to have existed from around 1600 to around 1046 BC, is the first archaeologically verified dynasty to exist in Chinese history, which traditional stories claim succeeded the mythical Xia dynasty, the legendary first ever dynasty of China that has not been archaeologically confirmed to have ever truly existed. Well, not yet at least. And its existence is proven by archaeological sites like Yinshu, which is on the location of the ancient Shang capital of Anyang, which contained tombs, palace foundations, jade and bronze artifacts, and oracle bones bearing the earliest records of Chinese writing that we know of. In fact, tens of thousands, apparently over 80,000 oracle bones of oxen, dogs, pigs, sheep, tortoises, and horses have been uncovered since excavation began in the 1920s, which suggests that the Shang had a deep love for mass animal sacrifice in their religious customs and rituals, usually to communicate with their god, Shang Di, or the Lord on High, in the spirits of their ancestors, who they believed resided in some kind of underworld, but could still influence the living world through their spirit power. And these oracle bones had questions on them that were written in an early, but still very decipherable version of Chinese character script, asking some shit like, is Shang Di harming our harvest? Or, should we sacrifice 1,000 oxen? And once the question was inscribed, the bone would then be heated with a metal rod, which would then create cracks on the bone, which the Shang king would then interpret as a divine response. These bone questions giving archaeologists and historians the best look and context into life in the Shang dynasty, without having to rely solely on the accounts of Suma, trust me bro, Qian. However, unsettlingly, the Shang didn't just stop at animal sacrifice, and were seemingly, based on all the archaeological evidence, were also big fans of human sacrifice as well. Mass human sacrifice. In 1976, archaeologist Zheng Zhengzhang and his team discovered an intact, unlooted Shang tomb, called the Tomb of Fu Hao, who according to oracle bone inscriptions, was a female military leader interestingly enough, and a consort to King Wu Ding of Shang, who may have reigned around 1200 BC. And in her tomb amongst the bronze, bone and jade burial artifacts, and pottery were, unsettlingly, 16 human skeletons stuffed into the walls of the burial pit. This was because Shang kings and royalty acted as high priests, uniquely able to lead sacrificial and divination rituals, interpret oracle bones, and commune with the all-powerful sky god, Shang Di, and the powerful spirits of the ancestors. And as befitting their priestly station, after a Shang king died, it was expected that his servants would all commit ritual suicide, or be buried alive to join their master in the afterlife, and continue to serve him even in death. Which sounds absolutely hellish. You live a life of a servant, and finally die, and are freed of servitude, only to then realize you're now an eternal spirit slave for the same lord you served in life. Brutal. And many royal Shang burial tombs contain several of their corpses buried alongside them. This honorable volunteer self-deletion practice being known as shunzong. However, there appears to have been a much bloodier and widespread form of human sacrifice performed by the Shang, known as renji. Unlike the shunzong sacrifices, which usually had male and female servants killed alongside their king, renji sacrifice seemed to be done exclusively on fighting-age males, and it's highly likely that those sacrificed this way were either slaves or captured prisoners of war. And based on bone examinations, these men were likely enslaved after campaigns and conquests of their lands by the warlike Shang. And the most notable group of people to be captured and enslaved are the Qiang people, who lived to the northwest of Shang territory. Oracle bone records recording up to 7,426 specific Qiang sacrifices. And these mass sacrifices would occur when shit was getting dire for the Shang, usually over lack of food from war, drought, flooding, or so on. And from the Oracle Bone records, it's believed that over 14,000 people were sacrificed in the final 200 years of the Shang dynasty, as sacrifices would usually be killed in groups of 5 to 10 at a time. But these kill groups could be way larger, with the largest known sacrifice seeing 339 people get murked in one session, with it being reported that Shang King Wu Ding sacrificed 9,000 people during his reign. That's some apocalypto tier god-pleasing. Jeez. And sacrifices were usually bound up and then decapitated, but bone examination reveals that they may have been brutalized in many other ways, and then their bodies and heads were then thrown into large burial pits to rot, or they were just incinerated, all to please pissy Shang Di. So based on all the available archaeological evidence, the Shang seemed to be a warlike, superstitious slave society that wasn't afraid to kill thousands of people to try and please their gods, which is extremely brutal, but not too uncommon for ancient civilizations like this. However, when the Shang fell to the Zhou, it seems that the Zhou promptly chilled the fuck out on the whole mass human sacrifice as part of their religion thing, and it soon became taboo to sacrifice slaves to make it rain in Chinese society, especially as Confucian ideals of morality and piety and don't mass murder slaves took root in Chinese culture, and direct Shangdi worship fell by the wayside for the Zhou's veneration of the more abstract higher power of heaven. However, if not for these 20th century excavations, we may have not ever known the true scale of Shang human sacrifices, as later Chinese historians fail to mention this horrific ritualistic mass murder in any real significant way, probably because it would be a bit awkward to say that the Chinese culture descended from a warmongering slave society that sacrificed prisoners and slaves by the thousands to placate a god that they didn't even really worship anymore. The Chinese wheelbarrow. I think this can refer to potentially two things. One, the fact that the wheeled wheelbarrow, the classic farming and gardening manual transport tool, not to be confused with the two-wheeled cart, was invented in China. The earliest archaeological evidence for the existence of wheelbarrows comes from carved stone tomb murals and reliefs from the Han Dynasty, which were found in Emperor Hui's tomb, dated exactly to the year 118. Art carved into the bricks of the tomb depicts laborers pushing a single-wheeled wheelbarrow around, which would mean that wheelbarrows had existed in China since at least 118, when the brick carving was created, and likely existed years before then, China unlocking the wheelbarrow and the tech tree way earlier than Europe, where wheelbarrows didn't appear until around the start of the 13th century, at least an entire millennium later. And this could also refer to the unique Chinese variants of the wheelbarrow, where instead of having a wheel on the end of the barrel, I guess? I don't know the right word for the actual tub you put your dirt and mulch in is called. The wheel is instead much larger and essentially placed on the wheelbarrow, and cargo was stored on each side of the wheel, or it could be expanded to hold even more crap. And the wheel's massive size makes it way easier to push heavier loads and navigate thin paths with ease, and there's no need to lift it at all like a Western wheelbarrow, where although the wheel helps you a great deal, you still gotta half lift the thing and whatever payload it's got to get it moving. And with this, you only need to balance and push it, which seems like a way better design, and it wasn't too uncommon to even see people hitching rides on these things too. Mohist aeronautics. So you probably heard about the big three of ancient Chinese philosophy: Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism, but you may not be aware of a fourth school that during its peak in the Warring States period was even considered a major rival to Confucianism. This philosophy is known as Mohism, and Mohism is an ancient school of Chinese philosophy, one of the 100 schools of thought from the spring and autumn period of Chinese history that are contemporary with Confucianism. And Mohism was created by its legendary sage, Mochi, and its beliefs and lessons are outlined in his eponymous book, the Mochi. Not super creative. But when you take the conservative, hierarchical, and ritualistic ideas and beliefs of Confucianism, Mochi looks like a damn weed-smoking hippie nerd in comparison. Mohist preached a universal love for all people, which greatly contrasted Confucian ideals of love being reserved and given mostly to family, before being spared for others. And they were also early pacifists, in the sense that they believed that war is justifiable only in a defensive context. After all, a land grab through military force is just a drawn-out and highly murderous robbery, and they promoted humble, frugal lives, criticizing Confucians for their expensive and wasteful rituals and ceremonies, and they stressed the importance of meritocracy over nepotism and hereditarianism, which was rampant in Chinese government, as lords and emperors would usually appoint their own friends and family to powerful positions, rather than skilled officials who were actually best suited for the job. But on top of being a school of thought, they also operated as a sort of engineering and mathematics guild, studying and making great contributions to ancient Chinese scientific understandings of optics, geometry, kinematics, and mechanics, and despite being wholeheartedly against wars of conquest, they were never afraid to up pole, or rather, up ballista, if conflict came to their doorstep, and they had reportedly innovated on siege crossbows, trebuchets, defensive walls and towers, mechanisms to drop rocks and other nasty shit on attackers, and even poison gas weaponry were just a few of the defensive weapons that they contribute to developing. However, interestingly, very interestingly, Mocha had created a design for a flying wooden bird. He then shared this design with Lu Ban, a legendary ancient Chinese engineer, who expanded on the design of the bird and flew it for 3 days and 3 nights. However, it's unclear if he just flew the bird or if he actually climbed on the back of the damn thing and flew around in the sky, because if he did, that would jump the Wright brothers by well over 2,000 years as the first manned flight in an honest-to-Shangdi flying machine, which would be a history-obliterating revelation, which makes it extremely unlikely to be true, and the wooden bird described in legend is likely referring to some kind of advanced or early version of a kite, which first emerged in the 5th century BC during the Warring States period. And Mocha and the Mohist are often credited with being the inventors, or at least the precursors, to the invention of kites in Chinese tradition. However, as the Warring States period drew to a close, and Qin Shi Huang unified China under the First Imperial Qin Dynasty, Mohism declined as siege warfare declined, and Confucianism became the dominant philosophy of China as the years rolled on, and the Qin became the Han Dynasty, with Mohism fading away over time. As there was really no need for a school of defensive siege engineers in this newly, mostly peaceful, unified China, and Chinese society and government mostly rejected Mohist teachings in favor of Confucian orthodoxy. But it's still very interesting to think about what this wooden bird doohickey might have looked like, and trying to picture a humble Chinese philosopher man riding on the back of it is a pretty fun thing to do. The Uncrowned King. I believe this refers to Charles George Gordon, later known as Chinese Gordon or the Uncrowned King, for his role in military campaigns to help quell the Taiping Rebellion for Qing China in the mid-1800s. Usually, people avoid joining the military if they can, as war is scary and dangerous. I mean, getting shot kinda hurts a lot, and you could find yourself dying on the other side of the globe while fighting over some foreign dirt you have no connection to whatsoever. However, Gordon here saw war as a path to adventure, and it seemed he didn't care if he lived or died, as long as he saw some action. He first fought in the Crimean War, after writing to command to be sent there, even saying that he hoped he died in combat while there. But he managed to survive, and once the Crimean War ended, he was again bored with his non-combat posting, and wrote again to the British War Office requesting to be sent anywhere in the British Empire where some action was happening, eventually volunteering to fight in the Second Opium War against Qing China. However, unfortunately for a corn worshipper like Gordon, by the time he reached China, the Second Opium War was pretty much over with. The Qing already got their asses beat at light speed. But fortunately for Gordon, and extremely unfortunate for everyone else, another conflict was raging in China, one far more vicious and devastating than any opium war, the Taiping Rebellion. I also have a video on this insane war if you want to check it out. It's also old, but I promise it isn't shit too. I promise. But TLDR, a low-level Hakka bureaucrat named Huang Shiquan, taking advantage of popular anti-Qing sentiment among the peasantry, while claiming to be the son of God and the younger brother of Jesus Christ himself, rebelled against the Qing dynasty and proclaimed the creation of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, kicking off a brutal civil war that may have killed up to 30 million Chinese people across a 14-year-long rebellion. Originally, Gordon was sympathetic to the Taipings. As a devout Christian himself, he thought they were some based, but curious Christians. But he quickly changed his tune when he saw the slaughter and brutality of the Taipings in the Shanghai countryside, who acted more like ISIS than a righteous Christian army, as the Taipings would slaughter anyone who refused to join them, would raze towns and villages to the ground, and they just outright murdered any Qing Manchus they could get their hands on, seeing the Qing as literal devils from hell. Gordon eventually was placed in the command of the ever-victorious army, a militia of both Chinese and Europeans who fought for the Qing, and he was praised by the Chinese officials, who lauded this strange soldier of fortune for his incorruptibility. Qing officials even getting annoyed at his constant request for money to pay his army in full, as they'd rather just let his men loot and pillage captured Taiping cities as their payment. But Gordon refused to let his men rob and plunder, as it went against his personal sense of honor, which caused plenty of problems within his army, as they were mostly an ideologically neutral force that was mostly fighting for loot and glory, whereas Gordon seemed religiously and morally motivated to stop the slaughter and desolation the Taiping Rebellion caused. He was also pretty socially progressive and respectful for the time, or at least he wasn't openly racist towards the Chinese, like many other Western generals were, and his ever-victorious army started racking up dub after dub, liberation after liberation of cities from the Taipings, Gordon hitting a high score of 33 consecutive victories against them. These victories giving the Imperial Qing army the breathing room it needed to press the attack towards the Taiping capital of Nanking, and Gordon was also notorious amongst both his allies and his enemies for his borderline suicidal bravery, as he always led his men from the front, usually armed with nothing besides his cane. And this fearlessness, along with his seemingly magical ability to rack up wins, his uncanny ability to somehow avoid serious injury, along with having strikingly blue Yakubian eyes, it made some Chinese believe that he had mastered harnessing his qi and had supernatural powers because of it. And Gordon's aura didn't go unnoticed by the Imperial Qing authorities either, as the Tongxi Emperor of Qing had sent a grand gift to Gordon as a reward for capturing the city of Suzhou, which included 10,000 silver coins, banners written in masterful calligraphy praising Gordon as a great general, and a handwritten letter from the emperor himself. But he refused these gifts for taking Suzhou, because he was still butthurt over an incident that occurred after he had taken the city. After Gordon had defeated the Taipings, he gave them his word that if they surrendered and fully laid down their arms, their lives and their families' lives would be spared. But the Imperial Army forces weren't so forgiving, and they entered the city and executed the Taipings and all of their relatives for the crime of treason, much to the fury of Gordon, who saw the executions as cruel and counterproductive. This rejection enraged the Emperor, who made Gordon sit on the war bench for a little while as punishment for his defiance. But Gordon probably got bored of not fighting and soon made amends with Qing officials, and he was back on the warpath soon enough. And after Nanking fell and the Taiping Rebellion came to a close, the ever-victorious army was disbanded, and Gordon was given an extremely special honor. He was given an imperial yellow jacket, yellow being a special color reserved only for the Emperor, his highest-ranking officials, and his bodyguards, and only 40 men alive in the entirety of Qing China had the honor of wearing the imperial yellows. So seeing this white boy in an imperial yellow robe was a real sight to behold. These exploits and awards eventually leading British newspapers to dub him the pretty uncreatively named Chinese Gordon. And this guy definitely had one of the craziest adventures in China I've ever seen a foreigner have. And Gordon's death while defending Khartoum was also made famous by the Charlton Heston movie of the same name, which is what he's usually more well known for than any of his exploits in China. Peking Man. This does not refer to finely cooked human meat, by the way. This refers to the bone remains of a subspecies of Homo erectus, dubbed Peking Man, found in Zhoukoudian Cave across several excavations in the 1920s and 30s, near modern-day Beijing, colloquially known as Peking at the time. Zhoukoudian Cave was full of Peking Man teeth, skull caps, stone tool remains, and even traces of fire usage, like fossilized ash. This discovery of Homo erectus remains found far away from Africa and within the caves of northeastern China, raising a slew of new questions about human genetic ancestry and our own evolution. Could this be an ancestor of modern humans? An offshoot that ended up being ultimately unrelated to modern humans? A secret, more sinister third thing? This discovery even caused a schism between Western and Eastern paleontology for a time, as Chinese scientists were more inclined to believe Peking Man is their direct genetic ancestor, who may have originated in China, instead of having ancestors who originated in Africa and later migrated to the Yellow River valleys. Although, modern science says Peking Man is still in line with the out-of-Africa theory, as it's seen as proof of human migration, not proof of human origin. But anyway, I'm no paleontologist. However, interestingly, in 1941, as World War II was raging and Japan was pushing deeper into Chinese territory, scientists began to fear that the Peking Man fossils would be looted or destroyed by the encroaching war. The bones were loaded up into 2 crates and were to be transported by American troops from the Peking Union Medical College to be loaded on the SS President Harrison, which would be docked at the city of Qinhuangdao, to then be transported back to the US for safekeeping. However, the bones never made it to Qinhuangdao and completely vanished along the way, leaving the location of these original Peking Man bones as a complete mystery to us to this very day. Whether they were destroyed, perhaps ground up for use in Chinese medicine, seized by the Japanese army, or simply abandoned by the troops transporting them, we will likely never know. And there have been rumors and reported sightings of the bones, like the account of U.S. Marine Corporal Richard Bowen, who while digging foxholes near the city of Qinhuangdao in 1947 during the Chinese Civil War, claimed to have dug up a box full of bones at this precise coordinate location, which appears to be under a modern-day highway. But luckily for scientists, plaster casts and dupes of the Peking Man bones had been created before they vanished, and more fossils continued to be found at Zhoukoudian Cave afterwards, which let research into Peking Man continue mostly uninterrupted. However, this isn't the end of Peking Man's tale, as after the Chinese Civil War ended and the communists took power under the leadership of Mao Zedong, Mao began looking to Peking Man here, well, scratch that, Peking Comrade, to help justify his new communist nation. Not only was Peking Man's existence used to make China seem exponentially old and uniquely independent from other nations, he also used it as a way to glorify communist ideology, claiming that these Peking men lived in an ancient primitive communist society where class was irrelevant, Private property wasn't even a concept, and life was focused on the collective survival of the group above all else. And this also held Mao's agenda to try and scrub the collective Chinese consciousness clean of long-held traditional Chinese creation myths and superstitions, and to try and ground Chinese history in a more scientific and Marxist framework. However, this usage of Peking Man to advance and justify CCP cultural goals eventually fell out of favor during the Cultural Revolution, where scientists were persecuted and pressed into manual labor, kneecapping research into Peking Man severely. And the Chinese Communist Party became more focused on economic independence and making sure that their new communist nation actually didn't go completely broke and collapse in on itself, over spending time theorizing about prehistoric communist monkey men. The Shanhaijing Bestiary. The Shanhaijing, or the Classic of Mountain and Seas, is a Chinese classic text and compendium of lands and beasts of ancient China, both mundane and mythical, believed to have been compiled anywhere between the 4th century BC and 1 AD, or perhaps even earlier. The Shanhaijing is first recorded in Chinese history by, can you guess? That's right, our old pal Sima Qian, the famous Han Dynasty historian. And it's unknown when the book specifically could have been written and who may have written it. Earliest writings on the book's authorship credit Yu the Great himself as the author, the legendary first king of China who tamed the Great Flood, which is most likely an analog for the constant flooding of the Yellow River, by diverting it into man-made rivers and canals, this feat giving him the authority to found the mythical and first ever Chinese dynasty, the Xia Dynasty. And the current king of China was so humbled by Yu's diligence and engineering prowess, he had no choice but to abdicate. The authorship is also frequently credited to a man named Bo Yi, another ancient Chinese leader who helped and served Yu the Great. But these guys are unlikely to be our true authors, as Yu the Great, Bo Yi, and the Xia Dynasty's history is far more mythological than factual. It's kind of like saying King Arthur wrote Beowulf for us Westoids. Others claim it was written in the Warring States period, perhaps by a man named Zhou Yan, a Mohist named Shi Chaozhi, or just some really weird dude. But regardless of who wrote it, this book is a pretty interesting beast, as it's full of mythical geographical locations and the beasts and gods that inhabit them, and the geography described usually following a squared shape, with large seas to the north, east, south, and west, all of which have mountain ranges surrounding them and distant wild lands beyond them further. And at the center of the world is Mount Kunlun, which is home of the gods, which is said to have 9 gates, massive jade palaces, and rivers of liquid mercury, jade, and cinnabar flowing through it. The center of the world is well known and understood, but still highly fantastical in this chronicle, and the farther away you go into the distant mountains and seas, shit starts getting a little strange and magical. And this book is most famous for its mythical and bizarre beasts, many of which still exist in Chinese culture, both pop and traditional to this very day. These beasts usually being representatives of gods, perils, virtues, omens, punishments, and natural forces. And let me go over a list of just a few of them. I'd be here all day if we went over each wacky creature and mythological location in this chronicle in detail, many of which exist in other legends and texts that expand on these creatures and describe new or different abilities, meanings, and appearances they may have. But let's just take a look at a few. The Tianshen, an unnamed celestial god that takes the form of an upright ox with 8 feet, 2 heads, and a horse tail, and it reportedly makes a buzzing sound like a bug. The Gu, or the Drum, is the son of the god of Bell Mountain that looks like a dragon with a human head, who according to legend, once killed someone or something called Baojiang, and for this murder, the supreme god Di executed him, and he then transformed into a giant hawk. The Shen, or the mountain gods, and there are several Shen depicted in the Shanhaijing, which usually come in the form of human-animal hybrids, dragons with human heads, birds and chickens with human heads, snakes with human heads, pig creatures with human heads, upright horses with human heads and 8 limbs, and a human with a dragon head, and a lot of other weird chimeras. The Bingfang, a pig-like creature that has a head and set of legs at each end of its body. You know, like cat dog. The Heluo fish, a fish with 10 bodies and 1 head that is said to bark like a dog and can cure cancerous lumps and stop you from farting when consumed. I wish this one was real. The Xiao, or the raucous bird, a bird with 1 eye, 4 wings, and a dog tail, and eating it will allegedly heal abdominal pain and diarrhea. Nice. Unusual humans. In faraway lands, there are several different types of humans with extremely bizarre physical traits reported to be living there, such as humans with 1 arm and 3 eyes who live to the north, people with faces on their chests, long-armed humans who can fish with said arms, humans with long legs, giants, tiny humans, hobgoblin human creatures with black heads, humans with horse legs who are great at running, giant humans with massive lips who eat men alive and also have reversed ankles so they can only walk backwards, and they also carry a tube. Animal-human hybrids such as humans with bird and dog heads, human-like dog people, humans with one eye, one nostril and one arm, humans with one head and 3 bodies, humans with 3 heads and a single body, humans who never die, cone-headed humans with wings, kinda looks like Angelic Kiadi Mundi here, humans with fish bodies, humans with a large hole in their chest, humans covered in fur, humans who exclusively walk on tiptoes, humans with 1 leg and 1 arm only, humans who have 1 eye and 1 arm permanently raised, and so many other weird non-human human foreigners. The Taifei, a green-looking dog creature with a human face. The Xingxing, a pig-looking creature with a human face. The Tianwu, a god with a beast body, 8 human heads, 8 legs, and 8 tails. The Liu fish, an amphibious chimera with the body of a fish, the head of an ox, a long snake as a tail, with wings and feathers on its ribs, and eating it also allegedly reduces swelling and inflammation. Nice. The Lili, aka the Power Cat, a fucked up cat-like beast with the body of a pig and spur-like claws on its feet. And when spotted, it's considered an omen that a lot of public earthwork construction is going to take place in the district soon. And this has got to be the most weirdly specific omen I've ever seen in my entire life, but I love it. Corpses. The Shanhaijing records several of what it calls corpses, undead humans with strange characteristics who wander the earth, likely as some form of punishment, like the corpse of Jubi here, a man with 1 arm and a broken neck that makes him look upwards at all times. Or the corpse of Gang of the Sha, who was decapitated during a battle, but somehow lived on and fled to Shaman Mountain, where he's usually seen brandishing a halberd or two, but never his head. The Huang, or the Yellow Steed. It looks like an oversized fox with horns growing out of its back, and if a person rides it, it's said that they can then live for 2,000 years. Maybe instead of downing Mercury cocktails, Huang should have just found and rode this fucked up fox, and he would have lived for another 2,000 years. The Shishi fish, a fish with the face of a magpie that has 10 wings with scales on their tips, and eating it apparently cures jaundice. The Zhuwei Wu, or the nine-tailed fox, a mythical fox creature that can take the form of a beautiful woman, as fox spirits are revered and believed to have special powers, and after 1,000 years, a fox's spirit can ascend to heaven and become nine-tailed foxes. And fox spirits are usually seen as tricksters, like we see in stories of fox spirits impersonating people and rulers to cause chaos and shit-cannery. The Baizhi, a white-horned lion beast that has 6 horns and 9 eyes on its head and body, and is often depicted with a human face. And according to legend, it once appeared before the legendary Yellow Emperor to school him on how to defeat all 11,520 different types of demons. The Bashe, a massive serpent so large it could swallow elephants whole, that is said to reside in mountainous valleys, and if you were to wear its scales as part of your clothes, it would prevent lung and heart problems. Sweet. The Zhulong, or the Torch Dragon, is a giant red serpent-like beast with a snake body and a human head with 1 vertical eye that could use its godlike powers to change day to night and back by closing and opening its eye, and its very breaths created the seasonal winds. The Shangxi, aka the Thoroughly Odd, is a horned, tiger-like beast that is believed to be a spirit of evil punishment that eats humans who have long hair. And there's another type of Shangxi, but that's described as an ox with porcupine-esque quills all over its body. The Dijang, a fun-loving god who likes to sing and dance, and is usually depicted as a squat round creature with 6 legs and 4 wings that's said to be in a state of perpetual confusion, or Hundun, which could mean that he's an embodiment of primordial chaos as well. But honestly, he looks pretty cute. The Yu bird, described as an owl with a human face, with 4 eyes and 4 ears, and is considered to be an omen of drought. The Pao Xiao, a goat-human hybrid creature with a goat's body, a human head and hands, and has its eyes behind its armpits. It also has tiger-like teeth, and apparently sounds like a baby. And it also eats people. The Kui, said to reside on the mythical Mount Flowwave that sticks out of the East Sea. This thing is a blue and black, amphibious, ox-like creature with no horns and only 1 leg, and it controls winds and rains by getting in and out of the water. And in legend, the Yellow Emperor hunted the poor thing and made a drum out of its hide. Also, his aura is as brilliant as the sun and the moon. The Fei Yi, a snake creature that lives on the Greater Lotus Mountain that has 6 feet and 4 wings, and is also reported to be an omen of drought when spotted. The Jingwei, a bird creature that lives on Departing Dove's Mountain, which according to legend is the transformed daughter of the goddess Nuwa, who drowned in the East Sea and transformed into a crow-like bird, and tries to fill the Great East Sea by filling it with pebbles and twigs, which might take a while. And the bird is often depicted as having a human girl's face. Minister Lu, an official of the water god of destruction Gong, who is depicted as a large snake with 9 human heads, who Wu the Great killed, but Liu's blood made the ground stink so bad, it couldn't be cultivated no matter how much Yu worked it. And of course, plenty of dragons, which in Chinese culture are usually associated with water, rain, and the seas, and are depicted with long, scaly serpentine bodies, with short limbs, fish-like tails, and with large horned and bearded heads, and are usually depicted as steeds for gods to ride on, or are pulling chariots ridden by gods, symbolic of their divine power. And that's all I got for you today. If you guys like this video and it performs well, we'll dive into the deeper layers. But for now, please let me know if I fucked anything up, got anything wrong, said anything stupid. I probably did. It happens. But with that, that's all I got for you today. And I love you very much. Goodbye.